Black Wall Street was one of the wealthiest African American neighborhoods in the United States. Officially called the Greenwood District, it stood just north of downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, occupying roughly 1 square mile. To outsiders, it may have looked unremarkable. To those who lived there, Greenwood was something rare and dangerous in early 20th century America, independent, safe, and proof that Black success was possible. Greenwood thrived. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, shop owners, hotel operators, and newspaper editors built lives of stability and ambition. Families owned homes and businesses. Children went to school. Money circulated within the community, strengthening it with every transaction. Greenwood was not merely surviving, it was flourishing. And then in the spring of 1921, it was destroyed in less than 4 hours. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where we examine the lives, behavior, and psychology of people who commit the most extreme crimes and what happens after the truth catches up to them. This story is about the Tulsa Race Massacre. History often softens it by calling it a riot, but it was not a riot, and it was not a misunderstanding that simply spiraled out of control. It was a coordinated act of racial violence carried out by the white residents of Tulsa, enabled by local authorities, and followed by decades of silence and denial. Tulsa was not an anomaly. This month, during Black History Month, we're examining a pattern that America has spent generations trying not to see. A pattern of Black communities being punished for prosperity, Black children being murdered for simply existing, and Black leaders being eliminated for challenging power. Tulsa was only the beginning. In the weeks ahead, we will follow that same trail through the Rosewood Massacre, the brutal murder of Emmett Till, and the assassination of Fred Hampton. Cases separated by decades but bound by the same refusal to protect citizens and the same failure to deliver justice. To understand how a community like Greenwood could be so easily erased and why justice never followed, we have to understand how it came to exist in the first place. Greenwood was founded in 1906, at a time when Oklahoma was still transitioning from Indian territory into statehood. The region carried the complex legacy of slavery, forced removal, and Reconstruction, and African Americans who were arriving in Tulsa weren't really entering neutral ground. They were entering a place that was shaped by a racial hierarchy, legal exclusion, and violence, but it was also full of so much opportunity. See, after the Civil War, many African Americans who had been enslaved by Native American tribes remained in what was called Indian Territory at the time. Many others migrated westward from the Deep South. They were fleeing lynching, debt peonage, and the tightening grip of Jim Crow laws. Oklahoma, newly opened as a settlement, promised land ownership and economic possibility in a way that the South just didn't. Tulsa itself was actually growing at an astonishing pace. The discovery of oil transformed it almost overnight from a modest town into a booming city. Money was pouring in. The railroads expanded. Hotels, banks, office buildings just sprang up. By about the 90s, Tulsa was being referred to as the oil capital of the world. But this prosperity wasn't really shared equally. Segregation was rigidly enforced. Black residents were barred from living in white neighborhoods, excluded from most white owned businesses, shut out of any sort of political office, so no political power. And rather than integrating into Tulsa's economy, African Americans were actually pushed to the margins. And out of that exclusion, Greenwood was born. One of the most influential figures in Greenwood's early development was a man named O.W. Gurley. He was a wealthy Black landowner and an entrepreneur, and he purchased 40 acres of land north of downtown Tulsa, and he made a deliberate, calculated decision. He would only sell or lease property to other African Americans. His goal was not just to provide housing, but he wanted to create a self-sustaining community built on ownership rather than dependence. And Gurley wasn't alone. Other Black entrepreneurs, professionals, and investors followed his lead, purchased land, opened businesses, and encouraged other neighbors to do the same. Churches became anchors of this community. Schools emphasized discipline, education, and self-respect. Fraternal organizations, social clubs, and mutual aid societies helped residents pool their resources and support each other during hardships. Greenwood quickly developed into this dense commercial district. Black owned grocery stores supplied people their daily necessities. Clothing shops had the latest fashions. Drugstores dispensed medicine and medical advice. Barbershops and beauty salons served as informal gatherings places. Shops and beauty salons served as informal gathering places where news was exchanged and relationships were strengthened, something that is still happening in today's society. Barbershops and beauty salons are still sort of the cornerstone to the Black experience. On top of that, they had restaurants, billiard halls, and theaters where residents could just relax and socialize with each other. The professional services flourished, and Greenwood became home to Black doctors who treated their patients with dignity, Black lawyers who represented clients in a hostile legal system, Black teachers who educated children to see themselves as capable and worthy. The district even had its own newspapers, which reported on local events and reinforced a sense of shared identity and pride. What made Greenwood especially powerful was the way that the money moved within it. Because segregation limited where Black residents could even spend their money, the wealth just circulated within the community. A dollar paid to a shopkeeper might be later used to hire a local carpenter, who then paid a teacher, who spent that money at another Greenwood business. This internal circulation multiplied the value of every transaction. And by the late 1910s, Greenwood had achieved something that was rare in American history: a self sufficient Black community, a self sufficient Black economy. Homes in Greenwood reflected that. Many were very well built, had multiple rooms, modern furnishings, carefully maintained yards. Families took pride in appearance, not as an act of imitation, but as a declaration of their own dignity. Education was so emphasized, and parents expected their children to achieve more than they were able to. Greenwood wasn't a monolith, though. There were even class differences within this community, ranging from working class families to affluent professionals and business owners. Yet there was a shared understanding that the success of Greenwood depended on mutual support. Prosperity was communal, not individual. And then the nickname came, Black Wall Street. And that was sort of a recognition of this just extraordinary concentration of Black wealth, ambition, and organization. It was not intended to be a boast, simply an acknowledgement by its own residents and some white observers that Greenwood represented something unprecedented and very special. And for the people who lived there, Greenwood was more than an economic achievement. It was a refuge from the daily humiliation of racism, a place where Black children could see Black authority figures, where success didn't require an apology, and where the future felt maybe not secure, but at least something they could hope for. That sense of possibility made Greenwood a very powerful place, and it also made Greenwood dangerous in the eyes of those who believed that Black people should never have that kind of power. Now, Greenwood's prosperity didn't develop in isolation, and it didn't exist without consequence. It grew alongside Tulsa. It was close enough to be seen, counted, resented, yet segregated enough to be treated like it was an anomaly. The two communities shared streets, rail lines, labor markets, and an economy fueled by the oil wealth, but they lived under entirely different rules. Greenwood's success was tolerated only so long as it remained symbolically contained, perceived as exceptional rather than something that other people could replicate. And most importantly, it had to remain non threatening to white authority. That tolerance was very, very fragile. For many white residents of Tulsa, Greenwood represented a contradiction they didn't want to confront. The prevailing ideology of the early 20th century depended on the belief that Black people were inherently inferior, less intelligent, less capable of self governance, less disciplined, and less deserving of wealth or autonomy. Sounds kind of familiar, right? It's kind of the thing that we see pushed in the news right now. That, oh, these Black schools have lower test scores, but we never look further into why they have lower test scores. Just understand that the concept that Black people are inferior didn't start 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago. This is something that they have been drilling into the brains of Black people for the last 450 or so years. And so it's no wonder that eventually some people have internalized it and made it a part of themselves. But for a brief amount of time in the early 90s, the people of Greenwood got to not feel like they were inferior, got to know for sure that they were intelligent, they were capable, they were disciplined, and it was okay for them to also have autonomy and wealth. They had paved streets, electric lights, brick buildings, luxury goods, professional class. And it was suggesting something that was unsettling, something that we still, even now, 100 years later, don't want to come to terms to in the United States. Poverty and marginalization are not natural conditions. They are ones that we impose on certain people in this country. And that 10 times out of 10, you give people who are in poverty the opportunity to make their lives better, they do. And that's something that's happening in our government right now. They are specifically trying to force certain people to be in the lower class by removing opportunity from them. I am a teacher and I fully and firmly believe, I know I've gone off script, but I fully and firmly believe that the attack on the education system within this country is because they want more of us to be stupid. Because it's just like comedian George Carlin said, like 40 years ago, they want us smart enough to work the machines, but not smart enough to know that we are being screwed over. But anyway, we'll get back to our story. Sorry that I went off tangent. Just, I believe very strongly poverty and marginalization are not natural conditions. Some people are not made to just be poor and stupid. And we have forced people to take on those roles. And that's so unfair. But the implication cuts to the core of white supremacy. If Black people can prosper under segregation, violence, exclusion, if they can create a functioning economic ecosystem without any white oversight, then the moral justification for that racial hierarchy will collapse. Greenwood did not merely represent wealth, it represented possibility, and possibility in a rigid racial order is dangerous. So white resentment toward Greenwood was rarely framed as opposition to prosperity. Tulsa was a city built on ambition, speculation, and rapid accumulation. Wealth was frequently celebrated as long as it was wealth that went to white people. What disturbed white observers was not money, but ownership. Not success, but independence. Greenwood's residents didn't rely on buying from white stores. They didn't function as a subordinate class within the white economy. They built, financed, insured, educated, and completely governed themselves. They had created something that was parallel to white Tulsa. And that parallelism threatened the social order more than an outright rebellion ever really could. Parallel systems imply there's choice, and choice implies power. Now, this resentment rarely took the form of open confrontation, at least not at first. Instead, it filtered through institutions. Quietly, with plausible deniability, local newspapers played a central role in shaping the public perception. Stories involving Black residents were often framed in very sensationalized language. It emphasized the danger, the criminality, or a moral failing. The headlines would exaggerate accusations. Rumors would be printed as straight fact, and racial identifiers were always emphasized when Black people were involved in an alleged wrongdoing. Also seemed familiar to today, right? Somehow, whenever the person who committed the crime has brown skin, we find a way to make sure we mention that in the headline. That is not to be transparent. It's to point out, look at those brown people doing bad stuff. And by contrast, white violence is frequently minimized, justified, or they don't even report on it at all. These patterns were not accidental. They conditioned readers to associate Blackness with threat and disorder and to interpret Black self defense or resistance as aggression. Greenwood, despite all of its prosperity, was constantly being portrayed as volatile, a place where violence lurked behind every corner, waiting to erupt. The narrative didn't require constant reinforcement, it just needed to exist and be ready to be activated when a circumstance demanded justification for force. Now, at the same time, Tulsa is undergoing its own transformation. The oil boom generated immense wealth, but it also intensified inequality in Tulsa. Fortunes were made quickly and lost just as quickly. Many of these white residents in Tulsa found themselves excluded from the prosperity that they believed should have been theirs. Economic volatility bred resentment, and resentment needed a target. Greenwood's visible success became a symbol for frustrations. Even though Black residents didn't have any control over Tulsa's economy, and just connecting this to modern day, remember there were many people during the last election who wanted to vote for our current president because they felt like they were going to get some sort of economic boom. And obviously that hasn't happened. But I think it's an even bigger conversation about how these powerful billionaires speak to poor white Americans. And instead of helping their lives, they point to successful people of color and go, look at that person. That person has your opportunity. That person has what you deserve. That's exactly what happened in Tulsa. And that's why we can't keep recycling the way that we talk about each other, because this breeds resentment. People today in 2026 are resentful of a Black neighbor who not just went to college, got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD, but they don't care about the fact that this person worked for 12 years to get what they deserve. They just go, they have something I don't have, and that's not fair. Even though you don't know if this person you're looking at was a DEI hire or if they worked their butt off all through school to get the degrees that they have and to get the jobs that they have. Frankly, it's very unfair to minimize people's accomplishments simply based on their skin tone. But as we see during today's time and in the past, rather than directing their anger upward toward the oil magnates, the land speculators, or the political leaders, the resentment flowed sideways and downward. And Greenwood was close enough to be blamed and distant enough to be dehumanized. The residents of Greenwood were not perceived as neighbors to Tulsa, but as competitors occupying space and resources that white Tulsans coveted. The Ku Klux Klan capitalized on these anxieties, and by the early 90s, the Klan had established a pretty significant presence in Oklahoma, including Tulsa. Unlike its earlier incarnations, this version of the Klan presented itself as a respectable civic organization. They weren't like the cross burning men of the South. They claimed to stand for law, morality, Protestant values, and Americanism. In reality, it was the same tool of intimidation, enforcement, and racial control as they had in the South. But what made the Klan especially dangerous was not simply its ideology, but its reach. Membership extended beyond just the violent extremists, and it was regular businessmen, clergy, journalists, police officers, judges, elected officials. This integration blurred the line between mob violence and institutional authority. When racism is embedded in power structures, it no longer needs secrecy. It can operate openly under the guise of order. See the Department of Homeland Security and the expansion of ICE. Now, the Klan's influence normalized the racial hostility within the area. It transformed what was private resentment into a public consensus. When violence is framed as protection of women, of property, of civilization, it becomes not just acceptable, but righteous. In such an environment, the idea that Greenwood posed a threat didn't need any evidence. It just needed to be repeated. The aftermath of World War I The aftermath of World War I further destabilized Tulsa. Returning white veterans faced job competition, housing shortages, and economic uncertainty. Many had been promised opportunity in exchange for their service and returned to find a crowded labor market and limited prospects. Nationally, this period was marked by labor unrest, strikes, racial violence. The Red Summer of 1919 had already demonstrated just how quickly racial tension can ignite into mass bloodshed. Tulsa absorbed all of these tensions rather than escaping them. The city's rapid growth created pressure on housing, wages, and public resources. White veterans who were accustomed to being treated as heroes now found themselves competing with Black workers who were more skilled, more organized, and more economically independent. The contradiction was intolerable. How could Black men return from war for democracy and claim the same rights at home? The answer was that they could not. The district set on land that grew more valuable with every year of Tulsa's expansion. What had once been considered undesirable land allocated to Black residents because white Tulsans didn't want it was now adjacent to downtown and vital infrastructure. Greenwood was no longer invisible. It occupied space that white developers and city planners just outright wanted. And that prosperity made Greenwood harder to displace legally. Its residents owned their own property. They had businesses, churches, schools, insurance policies, at least in theory. They weren't transient, they were rooted. And that rootedness complicated efforts to absorb or erase the district through ordinary means. And when legal tools fail, violence is soon to follow. Underlying all of this was a deeper anxiety, the fear that Greenwood represented a future in which racial hierarchy could not be maintained without force. If Black prosperity continued, if it spread, if it inspired similar communities elsewhere, then segregation would require increasing brutality to sustain it. Greenwood was proof that white supremacy was not self sustaining, it had to be enforced. And that realization shaped the psychology of white Tulsa. Fear masqueraded as vigilance. Resentment was disguised as civic concern. Hostility reframed as defense. Greenwood didn't need to attack white Tulsa to be perceived as a threat. Its mere existence was enough. The city stood at a crossroad. One path required acknowledging Greenwood's humanity, its achievements, and its right to exist. And that path demanded a reckoning with deeply held beliefs about race, power, and entitlement. The other path was much easier. It required only fear, silence, and the willingness to look away when the violence came. Tulsa chose the easiest path. And once that choice was made, the destruction of Greenwood was no longer a question of if, but of when and under what pretense. That pretext arrived on May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland was a 19-year-old Black shoe shiner who worked in downtown Tulsa, one of the hundreds of young Black men who labored daily in the white commercial district while returning every evening to Greenwood. Like many Black workers in the era, Rowland navigated a city designed to extract his labor while denying him any dignity. See, downtown Tulsa offered zero public restrooms for Black people. And this wasn't accidental. It was policy. Segregation extended beyond schools, housing, and transportation and reached into the most basic human need. For our Black workers like Rowland, even relieving yourself required planning, permission, and vulnerability. That brings us to the Drexel Building, a 6-story commercial structure at 3rd and Main Street. It was one of the few places downtown where Black workers were quietly permitted to use the bathroom. Located on the top floor, the bathroom could only be accessed by elevator. And on that day, Rowland entered the building for the same reason he had dozens of other times, to use the bathroom during his workday. Now, that elevator was operated by a woman named Sarah Page. She was 17 years old, and in 1921, she was young, poor, and very working class herself. She was just another person caught in the machinery of this rigid racial hierarchy. She lived with her parents and earned a pretty modest wage operating the elevator, a job that placed her in daily contact with both white and Black business people. Her position gave her a kind of proximity to power without actually granting her any power. Like Roland, she occupied a very vulnerable place in Tulsa's social order, but she was protected by whiteness in ways that he just wasn't. Now, what actually happened inside the elevator would later be described in dramatically different ways, shaped less by evidence and more by fear, rumor, and racial mythology. But the basic facts, however, are pretty simple and uncontested by the closest to this incident. Roland tripped as he entered the elevator, stumbling over the threshold, losing his balance, and he fell into Paige. Paige screamed. A white clerk from a nearby store rushed towards the elevator in response. Roland panicked and ran away. Now, we probably all know that he shouldn't have done this. However, he's 19 and he is living the duality of living in both Greenville and Tulsa. And so I understand why he ran away. Unfortunately, that scream would echo far beyond the walls of the Drexel building. Sarah Page never actually pressed any charges. She never said she was raped. She never said she was assaulted. There was no medical examination conducted. No sworn statement of accusing Roland of a sexual crime ever happened. Page herself told police he simply stepped on her foot and bumped into her and then ran away. Whatever fear she felt in the moment did not translate into a demand for punishment. But in Tulsa, facts mattered less than perception. And perception, when filtered through decades of racial terror, was lethal. The following day, May 31st, Dick Roland was arrested by Tulsa police and taken to the county courthouse. That's also where the jail was. Officially, authorities actually claimed they were holding him for his own protection. Unofficially, that arrest placed him in immediate and extreme danger. In the Jim Crow South and also Oklahoma, accusations involving Black men and white women had historically served as justification for mob violence. Lynching was not an aberration, it was an accepted method of control. Thousands of Black men had been murdered across the United States based on allegations that have been proven false, exaggerated, or completely made up. And Tulsa was no stranger to this history. Oklahoma had one of the highest lynching rates in the nation, and Tulsa itself had seen this kind of racial violence before. The city's white residents understood exactly what an arrest like Roland's implied. The mere suggestion of an attack was enough to seal this man's fate. What transformed a dangerous situation into a catastrophic one was the press. The afternoon of May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune published a front-page headline that would ignite the city. Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in elevator. The language was deliberately inflammatory. The word attacking implied violence. Girl emphasized her youth. And the Negro was printed in bold type. It framed Roland not as an individual, but as a racial threat. He was a stand-in for all of the Black people in Tulsa. The article itself exaggerated the incident, suggesting this was an attempted sexual assault despite the absence of any evidence or any charges. Some accounts indicate that an accompanying editorial, which has now been lost to history, may have openly called for Roland's lynching. Whether or not those words ever appeared in print, the effect was unmistakable. The newspaper didn't just report events, it shaped them. In a city that was already tense with racial resentment, economic competition, and white anxiety over Greenwood's prosperity, the Tribune's coverage was a match thrown right into a pile of dry tinder. By the late afternoon, rumors were spreading rapidly through the city. The stories grew more lurid with every retelling. He was no longer being described as a frightened teenager who had stumbled in an elevator. He was a violent predator in the white imagination, and the lack of evidence only made room for fantasy. Gossip moved through all the barbershops, offices, oil fields, saloons, fueled by alcohol, bravado, and fear. By evening, a white mob gathered outside the courthouse demanding that Roland be turned over. The courthouse became the focal point of the city's racial tension. Sheriff Willard McCullough aware of what was unfolding, refused to release Rowland. He actually barricaded the top floor of the courthouse, stationed armed deputies on the roof, and vowed to protect the prisoner. His actions were unusual, but not unprecedented. Some law enforcement officials did attempt to prevent lynchings, though often it was kind of half hearted. Outside, though, the crowd would grow larger and more agitated. Estimates vary, but by nightfall, there were hundreds of white men assembled. Many were armed. They shouted threats, demanded justice, and spoke openly about lynching. The atmosphere was volatile, charged with adrenaline and entitlement. For them, the courthouse represented an obstacle between righteous vengeance and racial order. Word of the mob reached Greenwood. And Greenwood residents understood the stakes better than anyone. They had seen what happened when white mobs were allowed to act unchecked. They knew that once a lynching began, it rarely stopped with just one victim. Many black men would be murdered. Black homes would be burned. Black communities terrorized, not as a spontaneous act, but as demonstrations of power. A group of Black World War I veterans decided they wouldn't be passive. They were men who had worn the uniform of the United States. They had fought overseas for democracy and had returned home to be treated as second class citizens. Many of them were armed, legally and otherwise, and they believed reasonably that if Roland were handed over to the mob, he would be killed. Later that evening, approximately 25 Black men marched to the courthouse to offer their assistance to the sheriff. They were polite but firm, telling him they were there simply to protect the prisoner. But Sheriff McCullough declined, insisting he had it under control. They returned to Greenwood, uneasy but hopeful that restraint would prevail. It didn't. As the night wore on, the white crowd continued to swell. Fueled by more rumors and the Tribune's sensationalism, the mob grew bolder. They tried to breach the courthouse. They began looting stores for weapons. Tensions escalated with every hour. Around 10 p.m., a second, now larger group of Black men, around 75 in number, returned to the courthouse. Once again, offering their help. Once again, they are turned away. And as they begin to leave, a white man confronted one of the Black veterans and tried to take his gun. A struggle ensued and a shot rang out. That single gunshot marked the point of no return. Chaos erupted. Gunfire broke out in multiple directions. People scattered. When the shooting stopped, several men lay dead or wounded. The white mob, now enraged and armed, and a lot of them drunk, surged towards Greenwood. What had begun as a pretext to punish one man became an excuse to destroy the entire community. The events that followed, the burning of Greenwood, the mass displacement, the loss of life and property, would later be called the Tulsa Race Massacre. But it is important to understand this massacre never started with any violence from Greenwood. It started because a kid stumbled in an elevator, was arrested with no charges, and a newspaper headline inflamed racial fear. Dick Rowland would actually survive the night. Thanks to the sheriff's refusal to surrender and the eventual intervention of the National Guard, he wasn't lynched. Charges against him were quietly dropped, and he would leave Tulsa shortly after. History remembers little about his later life, only that he became the unwilling spark for one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. What makes the story of Dick Rowland so haunting is not just its tragic outcome, but its banality. There was no crime, no conspiracy, no uprising. Just a guy trying to go to the bathroom. A city steeped in racial paranoia and institutions willing to sacrifice truth for control. The massacre wasn't inevitable, but it was made possible by a system that treated Black existence as provocation. In the end, the destruction of Greenwood was not about protecting white women or enforcing the law. It was about maintaining racial dominance in the face of Black excellence. Inside Greenwood, the news traveled quickly and with unmistakable urgency. The word passed from barbershops to churches, from porches to pool halls, from whispered conversations to frantic knocks at doors. A young Black man had been arrested, accused of assaulting a white woman. He was at the Tulsa County Courthouse. This was troubling news, but it was also a warning for the residents of Greenwood. They knew what an accusation like this meant in other parts of the country, and that means it could mean the same thing here. Tulsa, for all its wealth and modernity was not immune to these patterns. The city had already shown how quickly racial tension could turn lethal. Just a year before Tulsa, a white mob had lynched a white man accused of murder. If they could unleash that kind of violence against one of their own, Greenwood residents understood that a black teenager accused of doing the same kind of terrible thing would have absolutely no mercy and no chance. No one really knows with any certainty who ended up firing that first shot or whether it was an accident, but everyone agrees on what it represented. It shattered the fragile restraint holding the situation together, and in an instant, chaos erupted. There was gunfire all around the courthouse. White men began shooting at the retreating black group. Black men returned fire while they were fleeing, attempting to escape back toward Greenwood. Cars sped off. Within minutes, white mobs began forming throughout downtown Tulsa, and word spread that black men had attacked whites at the courthouse. The story grew exaggerated with every retelling. Some claimed Greenwood was staging an uprising. Others said white men had been killed in large numbers. Fear and fury just fed into each other, and the city descended into violence. Police officers and local authorities didn't actually stop anything. Some of them actively participated. They handed out weapons to white civilians. Deputies began deputizing people from the mob, giving them badges and licenses to act. Rather than simply protecting Greenwood, the machinery of law enforcement became a tool of its destruction. As the black men who had gone to the courthouse fled toward Greenwood, they were pursued. By the time the first fires were set, the city had crossed a point of no return. That stand at the courthouse had failed in its immediate goal. Yes, Dick Rowland did survive, but what was lost was massive. The effort to prevent a lynching had instead become the spark that ignited one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in American history. The violence that followed wasn't caused by the presence of armed black men at the courthouse, but this was a system that allowed angry, drunk, armed mobs to gather unchallenged in a society that treated black people as disposable by authorities who refused to protect the people they were sworn to serve. The men who went to the courthouse did so not to provoke violence, but they wanted to prevent it. By the time dawn broke, June 1st, 1921, Greenwood would lay in ashes. Hundreds dead, thousands displaced, and a thriving community reduced to rubble. This stand at the courthouse meant to save one young man from a lynching, marked the moment Tulsa chose destruction over justice. As the news traveled through Greenwood about what happened at the courthouse, people began to brace for what they knew was coming. Rumors of violence had been circulating all day. Armed white crowds had been gathering openly, unchecked, and emboldened by local authorities. By nightfall, the restraint, if it had ever existed, was long gone. And those white mobs that had been organizing all day long poured into Greenwood from every direction. They came armed with rifles, shotguns, pistols, knives. Some carried torches. Others carried cans of gasoline and kerosene. Many of them wore those hastily deputized badges by city officials, transforming ordinary citizens into state-sanctioned enforcers. They had been given permission. Shots rang out immediately. Black residents attempted to defend their homes, but they were met with overwhelming firepower. Men were gunned down in the streets. Others were dragged from their doorways and beaten. Families fled into alleyways and backyards as the gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. Greenwood, once a place of security, pride, and prosperity, was a war zone in just a few minutes. Homes were not simply burned, they were invaded. The white attackers would kick in the doors, ransack the furniture, loot the valuables before setting the building on fire. Businesses that had taken decades to build, law offices, grocery stores, barbershops, pharmacies, theaters, they were all stripped bare and then destroyed. Safes were broken into, cash registers smashed, merchandise hauled away before they set everything on fire. And the destruction followed a grim logic. Fire moved block by block, building by building, as if guided by a plan. It was almost as if the wealth of Greenwood was being erased deliberately, not accidentally. Anything that represented Black independence, that suggested permanence or success, was a target. Some white attackers posed for photographs in front of burning buildings. Others treated this devastation like entertainment, cheering as homes collapsed. The mob swelled as the night went on, joined by onlookers who had no intention of intervening, simply watching. Then came the airplanes. Survivors would later describe a sight almost too shocking to believe: small aircraft circling above Greenwood in the early hours of the morning. At first, many residents assumed they were being used for observation, but that illusion quickly vanished. Burning objects began to fall from the sky. Flaming balls struck rooftops, igniting fires that spread faster than the ground crews could manage. Some described the smell of turpentine. Others recalled explosions upon impact. Fires appeared suddenly in places the mobs hadn't reached yet, leaping ahead of the advancing attackers. These were not spontaneous, they were coordinated assaults. One of the most detailed firsthand accounts came from Buck Colbert Franklin, a prominent Black attorney and the father of future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Franklin had survived earlier racial violence and understood immediately what he was watching. From his office window, he watched Greenwood burn from above and below. I could see the planes circling in midair, he later wrote. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from the top. Franklin's words captured a truth that official records would later deny. Greenwood was under an aerial attack. Burning turpentine balls littered the sidewalks. Rooftops caught fire without warning. Wooden structures, so carefully maintained, became kindling. Entire blocks would ignite almost simultaneously. And the fire department did nothing. The fire crews arrived at the edge of Greenwood, and they were turned away by armed white men. In some cases, the hoses were cut. In others, firefighters were threatened at gunpoint and ordered to leave. A city that relied on Black labor, Black taxes, and Black commerce offered no protection in return. Police presence was conspicuously absent, except where it was used to disarm a Black resident. Throughout the night, any Black man who attempted to defend his home was arrested. Some were marched away under guard while their houses burned behind them. Others were shot where they stood. Women and children fled through smoke-filled streets carrying what little they could hold, many barefoot and bleeding. By dawn, Greenwood was unrecognizable. 35 square blocks lay in ruin, 1,200 homes destroyed. Nearly every Black-owned business in the district was gone. Churches, schools, and hospitals were reduced to ash. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the crackle of smoldering debris and the cries of survivors searching for their loved ones. Bodies lay uncounted. Many were buried in unmarked graves, some dumped in the Arkansas River. Official death counts would later claim fewer than 40 people, but survivors insist the number was much higher, possibly in the hundreds. The truth was never properly documented, in part because no one in power even wanted it to be documented. The survivors were rounded up, detained at gunpoint, and marched to internment camps, set up at convention halls, fairgrounds, and ballparks. They were held for days, some for weeks, and released only if a white employer could vouch for them. Greenwood's residents, victims of one of the worst acts of violence in history, were being treated like criminals. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot clauses. The city passed new zoning laws designed to prevent Greenwood from being rebuilt. When Black residents tried to return and rebuild anyway, they faced intimidation, legal barriers, and continued threats. But still, they tried to rebuild. Against every obstacle, Greenwood rose again, though never to its former height. The wealth was gone, the trauma remained, and the story was buried. For decades, Tulsa didn't speak of this massacre. It was removed from textbooks, absent from any public memorials, and it wasn't even acknowledged by officials. Survivors simply carried their memories in silence, knowing that telling the truth would bring retaliation, or worse. But the night Greenwood burned was not forgotten by those who lived through it. They remembered the planes, the fire falling from the sky, watching everything they had built, everything their parents and grandparents had struggled to achieve, consumed in a single night of sanctioned terror. In the aftermath of the destruction of Greenwood, Oklahoma Governor James B. Robertson declared martial law. The National Guard was mobilized and sent to Tulsa, officially tasked with restoring order and preventing any more violence. On paper, the declaration suggested intervention, restraint, the return of law. But in practice, it really cemented the unequal reality Black Tulsans had already encountered the entire day before. The arrival of the National Guard marked the beginning of another wave of trauma, carried out by the state itself. The guardsmen entered the ruins of Greenwood armed and authoritative and moving through the neighborhoods that were still on fire. They would encounter families wandering among the ashes of their home, people searching for relatives, trying to salvage anything. People were hungry, injured, and in shock, and rather than offering aid, the guardsmen ordered them to surrender any weapons they had. These Black men who had stood watch over their homes were disarmed at gunpoint. Veterans who served in World War I, men who had fought for democracy abroad, were treated as threats in their own city. Possession of a firearm, which was legal under Oklahoma law, became grounds for arrest if the owner was Black. The white rioters faced zero scrutiny. As the Guard asserted control, mass detentions began. More than 6,000 Black men, women, and children were illegally detained. They were held in places that were never intended to actually house civilians. Thus, the detainees were forced to sleep on concrete floors and bare ground. Food was scarce, medical care was minimal or non existent. Injuries often went untreated. The conditions were deliberately dehumanizing. Sound familiar, doesn't it? Guardsmen stood watch with rifles, treating detainees not as victims, but as prisoners of war. The families were separated, names were recorded or ignored without explanation. Many detainees had no idea how long they would be held, whether they would be allowed to return to what remained of their homes or their jobs. Release wasn't automatic. You had to have a responsible white citizen come and vouch for you. This requirement transformed survival into a transaction and reinforced the racial hierarchy. Those without employers, women, children, the elderly, the unemployed, were left simply waiting, detained for days, weeks, while the white Tulsans moved freely. No mass arrests were ever conducted among the white mob that looted, burned, and killed people. No detention camp established for the perpetrators of the violence. Martial law simply formalized the injustice. For many detainees, the experience was a bitter revelation. They had believed, perhaps naively, that government intervention would mean safety. But they learned that the same institution meant to protect citizens could be used to enforce their own racial subjugation. When the, detainee, when the detainees were finally released, they returned to devastation. Homes were gone, businesses smashed, personal belongings scattered or outright stolen. They had nowhere to go. The relief efforts were slow and, frankly, inadequate, administered through white-controlled organizations that would impose additional restrictions and humiliations. The city turned itself to rebuilding, but not to Greenwood. Rather than assisting Black residents in Reconstruction, Tulsa officials proposed those rezoning laws. The legal challenges and community resistance eventually overturned those efforts, but the damage had been done. The time, money, and momentum were lost. The mass detentions left scars that extended beyond physical destruction, and they taught a lesson that would echo for generations. Even in the face of undeniable injustice, the machinery of the state could be turned against the victims. Law and order was defined by those in power, and it did not guarantee fairness or protection. Now, I mentioned earlier that the official counts of the Tulsa Race Massacre would say both newspapers and city leaders would report that only 35 people had been killed, a number that grossly understated the true human cost. And these figures reflect not an honest accounting, but a deliberate attempt to contain the outrage and avoid responsibility. The Black bodies of these victims were buried hastily in unmarked graves, removed without records. Survivors actually spoke for decades of truckloads of corpses that were carried out of Tulsa under the cover of darkness. When the Tulsa Race Riot Commission released its findings in 2001, after years of survivor testimony, Archival research and forensic investigation, it concluded that the death toll would have been over 300 people, and the vast majority of those deaths being Black citizens of Greenwood. Even that estimate, the commission acknowledged, could never be fully confirmed because the destruction had been so total and the records so purposefully hidden. The physical devastation was just as staggering. It was actually more than 35 square blocks because it also encompassed homes, churches, schools, businesses, medical offices. Many of the 1,200 homes that had been burned were not modest dwellings. They had been carefully constructed. They were symbols of Greenwood's prosperity, and those families lost absolutely everything. The economic cost of this destruction was enormous by contemporary standards. In 1921, they assessed that the property damage would have been around $1.5 million, an estimate that would equal a little over $30 million today. And that's accounting for only direct losses. It doesn't include the loss of future wealth, businesses that would have expanded, properties that would have appreciated, wages that could have been earned, children who would have inherited stability instead of trauma. Greenwood was not merely destroyed in the present, it was robbed of a future. Insurance companies compounded this devastation by refusing to pay any claims. Most policies contained riot clauses, which the insurers invoked to deny compensation entirely. Black residents who had paid faithfully into these policies were left with absolutely nothing. Appeals were ignored or outright rejected. Legal recourse was non existent. The financial abandonment ensured that the rebuilding would be slow, painful, and self funded if it could happen at all. Human displacement was huge. In fact, nearly 10,000 Black residents were left homeless overnight. Men, women, children, and the elderly wandered through the smoking ruins, searching for any sign of where their life had been just one day earlier. They were forced to carry identification tags after obtaining white sponsorship. Many simply left Tulsa entirely, joining the countless Black Americans driven from their homes by racial terror across the country. Those who remained faced conditions that were just hard. They slept in Red Cross tents, enduring exposure, hunger, and illness. These makeshift camps would stretch from May into the winter. Families huddled together against the cold with little more than donated clothing and sparse rations. Children attended improvised schools or none at all. The trauma of the violence was compounded by the daily struggle to survive. Even in its destruction, though, Greenwood endured as a memory. Survivors carried the truth when institutions refused to record it. They remembered the scale of what was lost, even when the city tried to forget. The devastation was not a moment of violence, but a rupture whose effects rippled across generations. One question that echoed for more than a century: will anyone be held accountable? And immediately that answer was absolutely no. The legal case that had been used to spark the disruption just collapsed. Charges against Dick Rowland were dismissed in September of 1921. Sarah Page didn't even testify. There was no trial, no cross-examination, no public reckoning. Rowland himself disappeared. But the absence of justice went far past Rowland's case. Despite the scale of violence here, not a single white rioter was ever prosecuted. No arrests were even made. No trial to examine who looted the businesses, who shot unarmed people, who dropped incendiaries from airplanes. The legal system, which had failed to protect Greenwood during the massacre, now refused to even acknowledge that it had happened. Instead of accountability, they simply produced blame. An all-white grand jury convened later in 1921, but not to indict the perpetrators of the massacre. They concluded that Black Tulsans were responsible for this violence, arguing that Greenwood residents had incited the riot by attempting to defend Dick Rowland and their community. The official narrative cast Black self defense as criminal provocation. The judgment carried enormous consequences. It cemented the version of events that absolved the city, the police, and the state of Oklahoma of responsibility. It also sent a clear message to Greenwood survivors: the law will not protect you, and it will not hear you. In the years following the massacre, white supremacist power grew rather than diminish. The KKK members surged across Oklahoma during the early 1920s. Klansmen occupied positions of authority. Not surprising. It's very consistent, even in today's time. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre was omitted from school textbooks. Teachers were outright forbidden from discussing it, and newspapers avoided the topic entirely. City leaders refused to acknowledge it publicly. It wouldn't be until 1971, 15 years later, that the silence would start to crack. A journalist named Don Ross published an investigative report that brought national attention back to Greenwood's destruction. His work helped revive public discussion and encourage survivors to speak openly for the first time. Oral histories emerged, photographs resurfaced, and the official story began to unravel. In 2001, the Tulsa Race Riot Commission released a comprehensive report detailing the massacre's causes, events, and aftermath. The commission acknowledged that the violence was systemic, racially motivated, and aided by local authorities. And importantly, it recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants, including direct payments, scholarships, and economic development into Greenwood. This seemed like a turning point, a long delayed admission that justice required more than just acknowledgement, but the court disagreed. Legal challenges seeking reparations were rejected on procedural grounds, including statutes of limitation. Judges ruled that too much time had passed, even though the massacre had been deliberately concealed for decades and survivors had been denied access to court in the immediate aftermath. The law once again protected the institution rather than the victims, and no reparations were paid. This pattern was unmistakable. Violence met with silence, silence followed by denial, denial hardened into legal finality. And this message echoes across generations. Black suffering could be documented, even admitted, but never repaired. No justice, no reparations is not merely a summary of Greenwood's aftermath. It's a diagnosis of a broader American failure. Tulsa was a test of whether the United States would confront racial violence honestly. That test was failed repeatedly in the courtroom, city hall, classrooms, public memory. Greenwood survived. The people endured, but justice never arrived. And without justice, the debt remains unpaid. The Tulsa Race Massacre did not end when the fires burned out or when Greenwood streets fell silent. It cast a shadow that stretched across generations, shaping lives through absence of justice, absence of wealth, absence of acknowledgement. For the survivors, the trauma wasn't confined to memory. It lived on their bodies, their finances, their daily understanding of what it meant to be Black in America. Survivors like Olivia Hooker carried that burden for more than a century. She was only 6 years old in 1921 when the mob destroyed Greenwood. Her family home burned to the ground. She remembers hiding as violence erupted around her. And she remembered the confusion of being told, even as a child, that she wasn't allowed to talk about what happened to her. Silence was survival. For decades, Hooker and others discouraged by schools, by officials, by neighbors from speaking openly about the massacre. The message was clear: your suffering is inconvenient. Yet Hooker refused to let that silence define her life. She went on to become a trailblazer. She became the first Black woman to serve in the U.S. Coast Guard. Like many survivors, she sought recognition and reparations, not out of vengeance, but out of a belief in moral accountability. What was taken from Greenwood was not only property, but the labor and the promise of an entire community. You keep hoping, Olivia said at age 99, you keep hope alive. She died in 2018 at 103 years old. She passed without seeing justice realized, not in the form of reparations, not in any meaningful legal accountability, and not in a restoration of what Greenwood could have become. Her death marked more than the loss of a witness. It symbolized the steady closing of a living link to the truth, as survivors aged and passed away with the legal system delaying and deferring their justice. Today, the fight continues through descendants and advocates. Attorney Demario Solomon Simmons, who represents survivors and their families, has been unsparing in his assessment of the nation's failure. It's sad to know that they're probably all going to die without receiving anything, he said. Unfortunately, Black life in America is still not worth that much. His words reflect a painful continuity. The same forces that allowed for Greenwood to be destroyed in the first place have also shaped the long refusal to provide redress. Investigations acknowledge wrongdoing. Reports confirm the scale of destruction. Apologies have been issued, but material justice remains out of reach, as if recognition alone could substitute for the repair. The long shadow of Tulsa is not about the past, it's about what the nation chooses to do with its knowledge. Survivors ask to be seen, their descendants ask to be heard. And the question remains, is America willing to confront not just the history of racial violence, but its enduring consequences, and whether hope carried for more than a century will be finally met with some kind of action? Greenwood stood as living proof that Black Americans can build prosperity, governance, and culture in a nation determined to deny them all three. This was not an accident of history that the neighborhood was targeted, it was a reaction. Greenwood contradicted the lie at the heart of white supremacy. Black people are not inferior, not in intellect or economic power. Lies that powerful, though, have to be defended with violence. Redlining, highway construction, predatory zoning, disinvestment complete what the fires started in Greenwood. And that massacre was erased from the textbooks. America did not simply forget Greenwood, it chose to. And that choice reverberates into the present. The racial violence of today may not always arrive with torches and airplanes, but it is no less real. It appears in a disproportionate police killings, in neighborhoods flooded with surveillance, but starved of resources, in schools that teach around history rather than through it. It appears when Black wealth is still viewed as suspicious, Black protest as dangerous, Black survival as provocation. What happened in Greenwood established a pattern. When Black communities thrive, they are policed, dismantled, or destroyed. Like Colfax, Louisiana, Wilmington, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Forsyth County, Georgia, East St. Louis, Illinois, Elaine, Arkansas, Ocoee, Florida, Tulsa, Rosewood, Florida, Cicero, Illinois. All violent upheavals where the systems responsible absolved themselves of all wrongdoing. From Tulsa to Rosewood, from redline cities to mass incarceration, from vigilante killings to state-sanctioned violence, the through line is unmistakable. The ashes of Greenwood remain a warning and a question. What does justice look like when an entire city is allowed to erase a people and then forget them? I was reminded of Tulsa last year when that white community was being built in Arkansas. For most of my childhood and adult life, I have heard people in the United States say, if you don't like it here, just make your own place. We did, and it was burned to the ground in under 24 hours after decades of hard work. And this has happened dozens of times. We have built our own communities over and over and over, and every single time the same thing happens. Justice cannot exist without the truth, and truth is not passive. It demands recognition, repair, and responsibility. It demands that we stop treating racial violence like isolated incidents, rather than structural realities. It demands that remembrance be more than ceremony, that it be paired with action. Greenwood matters not only because of how it was destroyed, but because of what it revealed. The lengths to which America would go to preserve racial hierarchy, and the resilience of those who survived it anyway. The descendants of Greenwood carry more than their trauma. They carry evidence. Evidence of stolen futures, broken promises, evidence that prosperity alone does not protect Black life in a society unwilling to value it. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been a historical episode of When Killers Get Caught. This history isn't behind us. It's beneath us, shaping the ground we still stand on, written in land, policy, our bodies, and memories. And that's why it has to be told clearly and without comfort, because denial survives in darkness. But the truth of Tulsa, like all truth, always leaves a trail.